All right, so welcome everyone. Happy Tuesday, our first Tuesday in August. Thank you for joining us here for today's live training on chained applications. Before we go ahead and kick off into our content, I'll just go ahead and introduce myself real quickly. My name is Christine Bontius. I'm an instructional designer here at Alteryx, so all things training, whether that's Inspire, interactive lessons in the Academy, or doing live trainings just like this one. Some of you may have met me before, but for those of you who might be new for today's session, welcome. And again, I'm very glad that you could join along for today's session. So a little bit of housekeeping before we go ahead and dive into our introduction and then some content. It's just to kind of give a little overview about what we're in for today. This session is scheduled for an hour. I expect we have about 45 minutes or so of content, and then what we'd like to do is at the end is do kind of a Q&A. So I'll address some questions that may have come through the Q&A feature of the WebEx at that time. And wait for any other questions that may have popped up during the session that you would like to either pose to me or maybe pose to other people on the call, or maybe see if anyone has some other ideas about how to use Alteryx for things like chained applications. I just want to go ahead and let everyone know that as soon as you entered this call that you were put on mute. And since we are recording this call, I'd like to keep it that way. I'll try and keep an eye on it, but please try to not unmute yourself. It really helps us with the integrity of the audio. And if I notice anyone has come on mute, I will remind you kindly to put yourself back on mute. Otherwise, you will be forcefully put back on mute by my presenter privileges here in WebEx. That being said, we are recording today's session. So once we render this video for today, you will have access to this session back on the community site, back onto the live training post where you joined today's session. Give us about a week or so. It usually takes about us that long to render the video and get it posted properly. But once that's posted, you can watch this session again and again or share it with colleagues if they weren't able to make it for today's session. So just know that you'll have access to that once today's session is complete. If you do have any questions during today's session, we'd like to try and make this as interactive as possible, and I hope that you have some questions. If you have any that you'd like to ask during this time, I invite you to use the chat feature or the Q&A feature that's part of WebEx. I'll try and keep an eye on that, and when we have kind of some natural transitions in the presentation, I'll try and take a look at what may have come in, and if it's particularly relevant at that time, I'll go ahead and try and address it then. Otherwise, you'll probably see your question being addressed toward the end of today's session. All right, so let's go ahead and kick this off. We are talking about chained apps today, but before we do, we're going to go ahead and just give a little overview about what our agenda or what the session will cover. So first, we'll talk about some upcoming trainings that we have for the rest of August. We'll talk a little bit about some workflow background. I do want to emphasize here that with chained apps, this is much more of an advanced topic when it comes to apps and building applications. So I'm assuming a certain level of fluency when it comes to Designer and some of the tools that we're going to be talking about today, which I'll get into in just a second here. But you might find that, for some of you who may not be as familiar with these tools, we do have some other live trainings that we did just a few weeks ago, maybe like apps for intermediate users or something that covers a lot of these topics that kind of get you into today's topic. So those might be a good thing to revisit if you find that some of the things we talk about today might be a little bit advanced or maybe unfamiliar to you. We'll go ahead and spend quite a bit of time today in Designer, not a whole lot of PowerPoint for content. We're going to spend a lot of time building workflows and kind of reviewing the structure of some workflows that I've already put together. And then we'll talk about some resources that you have for support. So if you haven't been or spent a lot of time on our Alteryx community, I invite you to do so. That's at community.alteryx.com. It is a fabulous place where you can find answers quickly. You can search your own questions. You can search discussion forums and knowledge base articles and blog posts, and you can network and connect with peers, a lot of our Alteryx nerd friends who are trying to do the same things just like us. It's a great place to make connections, great place to strike up some friendships over a shared interest of analytics and using Alteryx and Alteryx Designer. There's plenty of inspiration up there for discovering new Alteryx use cases. I find something new up there every day that I hadn't thought to use Designer for, and I anticipate that you'll have a very similar experience there as well. If you see a feature in Designer or can imagine a feature in Designer that does not yet exist, we want to hear from you. Submit your ideas for things that you might like to see incorporated in future iterations of Designer, and our product managers are constantly perusing those boards to kind of see how this product can evolve to see what our users really want to use it for and how they want to use Alteryx. There's plenty of insightful blogs, our data science blogs, all the way through our analytics and thought leadership blogs, plenty of reading material. And then for those of you who are into developing tools and macros and apps, maybe with some of those SDKs, Python SDK, there was just a contest that wrapped up with some pretty cool things that people were making on the developer community with the Python SDK. So there's plenty of resources no matter where you're at with your Alteryx journey, whether you're just getting started or you're a seasoned pro. There's lots to see and do and experience on the Alteryx community. So we'll talk about some upcoming live trainings that we have going for the rest of August. That will be the rest of this month. So here we are today, August 7th, with chained applications, one of our more advanced topics, again, when it comes to apps and creating applications. Next week, we're going to be taking a little bit of a step back, maybe more of an intermediate level for parsing dates and times. Dates and times, for those of you who may have worked with those and some of the functionality in the formula tool or the date time parse tool, or the date time tool, excuse me, that's its formal name, may have realized that working with dates and times can be a little tricky, but we have some really neat tips and tricks to share with you and some really neat kind of strategies and approaches for how you can work with specifically date and time data. On the 21st, we're going to be running a session that's a little more introductory, so Alteryx for the SQL analyst. So those of you who might have a very strong background in SQL, that is your bread and butter. Maybe you're making the change or the migration over to Designer and you want to learn how to do some of those similar functions like cast that you used to do in SQL. Well, what's the equivalent? How do you do it in Designer? So we're going to spend quite a bit of time talking about some of that quote-unquote translation that you can do from your SQL processes over to Designer. And then finally, on the 28th, we're going to be running some tips and tricks. So some of those things that make you say, oh my gosh, I never knew you could do that. That is super cool. We're going to be sharing some of those that we've picked up over the past few months on the 28th. And then September, as you can see, we're still building out the calendar, but we're planning on running sessions on the 11th, 18th, and 25th of the upcoming month. So again, we record all these sessions and we post them back to community. So if you see something here that strikes your interest, but you know you won't be able to make this live training time slot, don't worry, never fear, you will have access to that material. But we hope you can join us on Tuesdays for our live training sessions. I just want to give a quick shout out to our Alteryx Academy. This is part of the community, but it's your resource and your one-stop shop for all things training. This is where we're going to be posting interactive lessons, and if you were around last week, you might have noticed that I alluded to a new course that is currently in development, and we are so close to getting it out for you, and I'm very excited about that. So keep your eyes peeled on the Academy for that coming soon. Again, all your access to live trainings, about 100+ hours of previous live trainings, and then you can register and download those meeting invites for future live trainings. Those all go up on the live training portion of the Academy. If you're ready to kind of give it a go, challenge yourself with our weekly challenges, where in Designer we post the start file and we give you the solution, and it's your job to figure out everything that goes in between. Every week we have between like 20 and 50 people who post the solutions, and it's pretty rare that you'll see the same solution to the same problem posted twice. So it's a really neat way to test yourself a little bit with some of these concepts that you're just starting to explore, or some of these things that you just want to practice, especially as some of you might be gearing up for product certification. We currently offer 3 levels of certification. That's Core, Advanced, and Expert, which we'll carry out at Inspire in London here in a couple months. That's where you really get yourself tested on what you know, what you don't know in Designer, and how can you prove and demonstrate your knowledge and your prowess when it comes to some of these things with building workflows in Designer. So if you haven't yet, there's still time. You can always register for product certifications, and that's all of this. You can be found at academy.alteryx.com. All right, let's get started with why we're here today, which is chaining applications. So this question kind of can come up quite a bit, is why would I want to chain an application in the first place? Why do we run a session specific to chaining applications together? And really the reason that we would create a chained app that I can justify in my own mind is to create this narrowing effect. It's essentially this filter that as a user progresses through an app interface, they are actually receiving options or receiving feedback from a workflow that is eligible and specific to a selection that they have made in a previous interface selection. So it's like creating dependencies. And the way that I can think about this is by this triangle diagram I've created over here on the right. The data that we're going to be looking at today is all about the Olympics from about 1896 all the way to, I think, maybe 2016, I can't remember. But what we want to do is we want to make sure that a user can't select values that really aren't relevant to what they just selected in a previous window. So for example, if in a window I ask you, do you want to learn about the Summer Olympics or the Winter Olympics? And let's say you click Summer Olympics. Well, in the next window, let's say it's a drop-down or a list box, I don't want you to be able to select 2002. Because there was no Summer Olympics that happened in 2002. They were in 2004. And then from there, if I select 2000 or Summer 2004, I only want you to be able to select water polo. I don't want you to be able to select ice skating or skiing or a sport that isn't relevant to what you just selected in the previous interfaces. So it's really this way to winnow or narrow down how a user can navigate through an application and how they can select eligible values based on what they've already selected in a previous window. One big advantage to this is that second bullet right there, is that you're eliminating a possibility to allow a user to select an invalid combination of values. And I'll show you what I mean when I show you this workflow that I cooked up for you this morning. It's an app interface. It's basically the same app that I've broken out twice. It's one app that's all in a single interface versus the same app that's pretty much broken out into 3 chained interfaces. But you'll see how in the first app, if all of my selection opportunities are in the same app interface, I'm giving you the opportunity to create a value or create a combination of values and update values in a workflow that won't produce any results. So it's a really nice way to kind of create this opportunity and kind of corral maybe your app user into having a more customized experience as they go through their app. And then finally, you can create this opportunity for communication between a user and an app interface. And one of the nice ways I like to think about this one I've seen is you can make a really fun game in Designer. You can actually make Jeopardy for yourself, which is kind of fun. You can find the questions and then you can find the answers. You can actually create a Jeopardy game where you say, okay, select your question category and select your value. How many points or how many dollars do you want to try and earn off this question? So if I pick a category that's worth $200, then all of a sudden you'll get the question in the next interface that's relevant to what you just selected. And then you can prompt your user to say, okay, what do you think the answer is? Submit the answer, and the app will tell you if you got it right or wrong. All of that kind of communication between selecting an answer, validating an answer, that's all created through this chained dynamic process that you can configure in an app. So why chained apps? So now you're sold. So let's talk a little bit about this use case that we're going to be working on today. The issue, and particularly how people explain why they want to use a chained app, or they explain the problem and then the answer is that you want to create a chained app, is that you want an app interface to dynamically update based on what a user selected in a previous window. So again, that Olympics issue, if you select Summer Olympics, I don't want you to be able to pick 2002. I only want you to be able to pick 2004. I want that window to update dynamically to allow you to see the options available to you based on a previous selection. So what we're going to do today is we're going to create an app that allows a user to select values in an app interface. So this is kind of that level of fluency that we're assuming, that you know how to use a list box and you know how to use a drop-down in a workflow. But we'll kind of review those so that way you can catch up to speed in case you're not completely familiar with those. And then we want to configure those apps and chain those apps together so that you're able to choose values relevant to a selection that you made in a previous question. And then we'll kind of talk about some opportunities that you have for displaying those results to your user in the end. One of them being PCXML, which is how you can view those apps or those results on the gallery. So some of these key concepts that we're going to be covering today is really we're going to be talking about configuring chained apps with relation to using list boxes and drop downs, not drop boxes, drop downs. Really because those are the interface elements that display value. So things like you might be thinking like, well, what about numeric up downs, or what about text boxes or things like that that you can also use? Well, yes, you can also use those in an app interface. Those we can't dynamically update based on an incoming file or based on a user's previous selection. Those are pretty much hard-coded values that you can configure in those interface elements. So really list boxes and drop-downs are where it's at when it comes to giving users opportunities to select values that you populate in those tools. And then we're going to be talking quite a bit about using the interface designer to chain applications together. The chaining component of chaining apps together is all done in the interface designer. So it's really important to understand where that configuration option is and how it is used and how it is implemented. So first, let's talk about why we're talking about list boxes and drop-down menus in particular when it comes to chained apps. And really, it's for two reasons. And one is because these two interface tools are really the two opportunities that you have to display a list of values for a user to select from. Ending on a preposition, not my best moment, but really you can imagine in your head when you click a drop-down that all of a sudden there's values for you to pick in that drop-down. Or if you see a list box, there are values that you can select, one or more, in this box. And that's where how you populate those values, this is where the chaining can be really important because you only want relevant values to show up in that drop-down menu or in that list box. So values can be displayed in a drop-down or a list box in a number of different ways. So if you see on that box on the right here, here's the list box specifically configuration window, but the same configuration window, especially with this list values drop-down, is the same in both the list box and the drop-down tools. And this is because you can populate values in those two interface elements in the same ways. One, you can do it manually. You can manually type in values into a box to display in those interface elements. Definitely not a dynamic thing to do. Once it's manual in there, it's hard-coded, and this is not a good thing to use for chained apps. You can display by data type, may be usable, but particularly you're going to want to look at fields from a connected tool, which is one of the ways that will show how it's not actually really well suited for a chained app situation. What you really want to be doing is importing values from a file that a previous app creates. So we'll spend quite a bit of time on what that means and how you create those values. Secondly is the interface designer. The interface designer is accessed in Designer. It's not a tool. It's not anything that you can drag onto your canvas. It's actually a window that does not display by default, but it's under the View menu up in Designer. If you go to View, then you'll see an option to select the Interface Designer. And there's a couple of different views in that Interface Designer. One of them is the Properties view, which is indicated by that little wrench there that's in a blue box, bottom left of that Interface Designer window. And this is where the magic happens when it comes to chaining apps. This is where you select to run another app based on the success of an app, and where you decide to display the results to a user or not display the results to a user. So we'll show you how to navigate that screen as we configure these different or these portions of these chained applications. All right, so it's time to jump over in Designer, which is very exciting. And while I do that, I will go ahead and stop sharing my screen briefly just so I can take a look and see if there's any questions that have come into the chat before I go ahead and pull up a workflow for all to see. So it looks like I don't have anything in the chat yet, so that is good. So let's go ahead and get started here. I'll go ahead and pull over Designer and reshare my screen. All right. So let's take a look at this workflow. So as you can see here, we have a couple of different workflows on the screen. The first one we're going to land on is this app for the Olympics. Let me kind of just maybe zoom this a little bit so we can see what's going on here. You can see that this app has a number of different interface elements where we have some drop-downs that we've configured and some list boxes that we've configured, all to analyze some Olympic data. So let me go ahead and run this for you just so you can kind of get a sense of what's going on here and why we might want to create an application or a chained application, out of this data. So that data that we are dealing with is all the Olympic athletes that have competed in the Olympics since about, I think 1896 might be our earliest year here in this data set, so 1896. So you can see that we have different the years and the seasons of those Olympics, where those Olympics were held, the sports that were competed in. This is my favorite here. This is one reason we'll talk about in a second about why we want to build chained apps in the first place. That tug of war used to be an Olympic sport. That would have been pretty fun. But you can see that we want to give users the opportunity here to search based on a season, so whether it's summer or winter Olympics. So as you can see here in my hard-coded workflow, let's just work through our summer Olympics. And then we want to be able to give them the opportunity to select a year. So what year of those Olympics do we want to analyze? So 2004 is hard-coded here, but again, we can update those in our filter. And then we want to know what sport that they want to look at, or sports, because you can see we have a list box connected here, so that'll give us the opportunity to pick one or more sports. So what sports were competed in the Summer Olympics of 2004, and then the gold medalist. And again, you could make an interface element to select, or an interface element to select silver medalist, or all the medalists, or whatever you wanted, but I just simply hard-coded it down to just the gold medalist for our viewing ability. So all of our summer 2004 swimmers that earned gold medals. And as you can see here, if you remember this year pretty well, this was the year of Michael Phelps when he was really racking up those golds. So now that we kind of understand what this workflow does, let's talk a little bit about the interface elements that are connected to it. So we've talked about a couple, drop-downs. This is a demonstration of an app, I will say, that can be thought of being dynamic because these drop-downs and list boxes, as you can see, are being populated by fields from a connected tool. So great, they're coming from the tool that's just upstream, so it's being populated with values that are relevant based on the incoming data, based on the user's previous selection. So fantastic, we're populating these values, we're getting away from our very manual entry, we're displaying by field types, and if you are familiar with this kind of configuration, what I've done here is simply to populate the drop-down of like seasons, so summer and winter. All I simply do here is I group by our seasons twice, so summer and summer, and then I cross-tab them to feed in a list of values here that is summer and winter into my drop-down menu. I do the same thing for years, so based on this selection here of Summer Olympics, here are the years that are relevant to Summer Olympics. So again, that's a big group by, it's another big cross-tab, and feed those into my drop-down menu where I'm allowing a user to pick one of those eligible years. And then, based on this selection, I'm going to go ahead and drop down or do the same thing with my sports. So what sports were available to pick in 2004 Summer Olympics, and then allow a user in my list box to select the ones that they would like to update my filter here. So it looks all fine and good because everything's coming in from an incoming connected tool. But let's go ahead and just run this, and let's see. Let's run this as an app in Designer. Let's drag this over here. So you can see here in my app, because my app interface elements are all in a single window, is that they're actually not going to be as dynamic as we think they are. And let's go ahead and just double check this. So let's say I want to actually pick the 1972 Olympics. Well, what I know is that some of these sports weren't around in the 1972 Olympics, or even better, in the 1896 Olympics, when tug of war was a sport in these Olympics. And you can see it does not update based on a previous selection of summer and even 1900. Does it update here in this particular window? Well, no, it does not. Tug of war is still not an eligible sport for me to pick. And in some of these years, some of these sports weren't even around yet. We didn't even have handball in the 1900 Summer Olympics. So you can see that while I've configured my app to be seemingly dynamic with fields from a connected tool, this app interface is still very much stuck. It's not dynamic based on what I pick here in an app interface. So let's go ahead and make this dynamic. And the way that we're going to do this is by breaking this up into a couple of different points. The way I like to think about building my chained apps is to determine what interface element needs to be updated or what needs to reflect a change based on a previous selection, and then where's the natural breaking point in my workflow to cut off that process before essentially starting another app. And I'm sure you guys are all looking at this. It's pretty well evenly chunked out and pretty simple too, because I've really split out all my criteria into separate filters. But you can already see this chunk right here. This is an app interface element that, depending on a user's choice of Summer or Winter Olympics, they should see different options available to them in the year selection, right? So this chunk right here is really another app interface. The drop-down menu of years should have the values that are only relevant to Summer or Winter Olympics, depending on the selection. And then a third element comes into play with this list box. This list box should only show the sports that were around in the year that was chosen and for the Olympic season that was chosen. So we're really looking at 1, 2, 3 different applications that we're going to create. So let me walk you through now those 3 apps that I created in order to address this problem. Go ahead and clean some of this up a little bit for us. So now that we see why this is not dynamic, let's talk about what is the dynamic solution. And the first is this first app. So let's first deal with that first interface element, which is selecting our season. You'll see it looks very similar to the beginning, right? It looks very similar to that first chunk of an app that we developed. And in fact, because it is my first step, I can still get away with doing some of my in-workflow analyses, which is connecting fields in a dropdown to fields that exist in my input data. So again, I'm just going about summarizing and cross-tabbing to populate my list box based on fields from a connected tool and just feeding those right on through. Now, one thing that we have to think about when we create or when we start breaking out apps into different chained processes is the kinds of outputs that we need to create in order to facilitate or kick off that next process. So what do I need to create in app 1 to make sure that the second part of the app can run? And then what do I need to make sure in app 2 to create so that the third part of my app can run? And as you can see, to address that particular question, I'm creating 2 different output files here. Creating output files is actually one of the ways that it might not seem as dynamic, like why are you creating outputs? You know, that's just one more step that you could do when you could just be feeding in lists from another tool. But because these outputs could be overwritten with every run of an app, you know, really rewriting and creating these outputs are one of the ways that you can store that user's data or the data based on that user's selection to then populate another process. So creating outputs might not seem like an ideal solution here, but in this case, it's the way to make this as dynamic as possible. So I have to create 2 outputs. One is going to be, and this is where the chain comes in, the output from app 1 is the input to app 2. This is the connection, or one of the connections, that what I create in the first app is what's being used to start the second app. And you might find that different naming conventions work better for you, but what I like to do is I like to be very clear and explicit about what each output is for, because one of the worst things you can do with a chained app is accidentally connect the wrong output and then feed it in as the input to another tool or feed it into the input of another part of the app where it shouldn't actually be. So what I like to do is I like to create these outputs that are named. App 1, this is the app that created it, the season output. So this is all the season data. So based on this drop-down menu, I'm going to output all that season data. So whether it's summer or winter, that's going out into this output file. Sounds easy enough. This is what's going to be read into App 2 as the input. But before we get there, let's talk about the next output that I've created here. This output is going to be used to populate App 2's drop-down menu. Remember, there's a couple of different ways. You can populate a drop-down menu from manual entries, from field types, from fields from an incoming tool, or from an external file. The rule about populating fields from an external file is that you have to have two columns of data. One is called name, and one is called value. And to just demonstrate that, let me just go ahead and throw on a new workflow here, and let me just demonstrate that. So, drop-down. So in our drop-down tool, just to give you a little bit of a refresher here, in this list values box, let's drop this down, we're looking at this option. Populate values in a list from an external source. And again, like I just said, must contain name and value fields, okay? So that is why in my seemingly silly output name in this particular app here, is that in my summarize tool, I've created two different columns, the name and the value, which you can just name right here in your summarize tool output field name. But these are the values, these are the years that I want a user to be able to select from a list of values based on this filter's analyses of all the data that's pertinent to Summer Olympics. I hope that makes sense so far. So let's go ahead and then talk about how this feeds into the next app, which is App 2. So App 2 essentially picks up where the other app left off, which is now giving you the option to select a year. Based on the type of Olympics you picked, what year would you like to look at? So you can see, again, this really small chunk right here is just a drop-down updating a filter, but that second chunk that existed in our original workflow here is now broken out into a separate workflow. The input is that App 1 season output. So again, where we just left off, we're picking right back up. We're feeding that file into App 2. Now some of you might be thinking, well, okay, like here's the chain part though, is that App 1's file has to be created before App 2 can use it. And yes, absolutely true. That file has to be created before App 2 even knows it exists or knows that it's around or eligible for it to use. We'll talk about that in a little bit when we talk about the interface designer to configure the chain. But keep that in mind, is that for a file to be used downstream, it has to be created upstream. It has to be created before it can be used. So it's been used here, App 1 season output, and you'll notice that this dropdown is now configured a little bit differently. There's nothing coming in from an external or a connected data set at all. Instead, this dropdown is being populated or configured to take those list of values from that file that we've created. Again, in App 1, remember that we created this file that's called App 2, dropdown input years. Again, pretty specific as to what that is. That is the file that I am using to populate my drop-down menu, which I've just selected here from my properties box. So pick that file, navigate to that file wherever it may be. So now you'll see, let's talk a little bit about these outputs that are being created here. We have that third step. So once we have our season, winter or summer, and we have our year selected, we have our third element, which is that list box, which is the list of sports that are relevant based on our selections based on year and season. So again, we're going to create two outputs, one being called App 2 output. So this is all the output that we've created from App 2 that will serve as our input to App 3. So there's the chained part between 2 and 3. And again, we're going to repeat the very same steps here with summarizing by sport, so all the different sport types that we could pick in App 3 in our list box, grouped by or called, renamed to name and value. And again, I'm going to create that as another output file, App 3 list box input. So now let's see that third and final part of our chain as it relates to actually building the app interface component of this. So again, App 2 has the input, or App 3 has the input that was created in App 2 as its output. So there's the chain again. So whatever was created in App 2, I am feeding in as the input to App 3. I am going to, in my list box, choose the same exact configuration of creating my list values from external fields. So again, name and value must exist in those fields. That file must be created previously, and that file must be defined in this list box tool. And then because we're just hard coding for gold medals only, we're going to leave that. We could add an interface element there if we really wanted to. You might even choose to do that as another chained portion, just in case, well, I don't know, maybe one year they didn't have bronze medals or something like that. But you can see here that we're just going to leave this hard-coded to only output our gold medalists. And then we're going to throw a browse tool onto the end of that particular workflow. So now we've set up these different workflows. We have App 1, App 2, and App 3, and they should run in that order. In fact, I like to number them. You might, again, find that another nomenclature, another naming convention works for you, but I like to number my apps. I like to know that App 1 runs before App 2, and App 2 runs before App 3, and I like to just number my workflows in that way. It helps me keep track of them. Otherwise, if I name them with just the processes, I won't remember, and I'll put them in the wrong order. And I'll show you why that can be important with order and keeping the order straight. So let's start from the end at this point. So now we've created 3 different apps that exist separately as their own separate workflows. So how do we tell App 1 to then run App 2 and then tell App 2 to then run App 3? Well, it's all going to be in this interface designer. So this is your view menu right up here. So you have File, Edit, View, Options. Help View has the option to open your interface designer. And the interface designer, I'm sure those of you who have already taken a stab or are pretty seasoned at building apps, you already quite know the value here of the interface designer, but just as a quick run through, what's here for you is one is your layout view. Is you have all your different question elements and you can arrange them and organize them and however you want using these up and down arrows and add all sorts of nice interface elements here for grouping and labels, things like that. You have your test view, which this kind of gives you a nice overview as to what that app question component is going to look like in your app interface, and it also gives you a way to click a few things and then open debug as if you were the app's end user, and you can actually see the workflow populated with those different values that you've just selected here. You have your tree view, which kind of helps highlight the different hierarchies that exist between a question or an interface element and its associated action tool, if one exists. But this is the window that we're going to be most concerned with today, and it's your properties window. Again, that little wrench icon there at the bottom left has a couple options that are really particular for building chained apps. And really, it's these two right here. It's these two checkboxes for on success, run another analytic app, and on success, show results to user. One thing I want to highlight when you're building chained apps is notice the wording on success, run another analytic app. This determines the order in which I like to start building a chain, because on success, run another analytic app means you're not going backward. You're not configuring in app 3 what runs before it. So for example, if you had app 4 in the chain, you would configure app 4 to run after app 3 runs. Let's kind of put that into practice here by taking a look at app 1. Let's start our chain from the beginning. This is, again, why I like to number my files. Is I know where to start, I know what needs to come next, and I know where to end. So from app 1, let's go back and revisit the interface designer here. You can see that I've configured this particular app to, once it runs successfully, then I want you to run app 2. I want you to throw me right into the interface for app 2. And all it takes is a simple check of this box. If it's unselected, nothing will happen, or deselected, nothing will happen. As soon as it's checked, then you want to tell it, you want to tell this app which app to run next. Again, that will be app 2. You'll notice the second box here is on success, show results to user. This is a moment or a opportunity, I guess, of app design, where you have the ability to decide if you want to see or if you want a user to either receive a message or see any kind of intermediary outputs along the way in the app interface. When I build chained apps, unless I have a really good reason to, I usually don't display any results to the user until the very end, because odds are they don't care about the results until the very end anyway. So I will unselect or deselect the option to show results to my user. You'll see that I do have results to possibly show. In fact, I have 2 output tools that I could demonstrate or display to my user in the middle of this app interface. But I'm going to disable that opportunity. I'm going to just say, don't show any results until the very end. So this is the chaining mechanism. This is really the chain and what keeps the flow going. So as you can imagine now, as soon as we pick up at app 1, we're going to jump right into app 2. But remember, from app 2, we have one more app. We have app 3. So let's go ahead and configure the same thing. So in the Interface Designer's Properties view, I'm going to tell it, hey, after you finish app 2, you have one more thing to run, and that's app 3. Now, you can probably really see why I like to number my files, because imagine if you had 6 app steps or 10 app steps. Without numbers, you might not really remember what comes next. The numbers help me keep it straight. So after app 2, run app 3. And again, because we're not done yet, I'm not going to display any results to my user. So I'm going to say, leave that box unchecked for now. App 3 is our stopping point, remember? So now in your mind, I'm sure you're thinking, okay, you're already anticipating how this window is configured. We have nothing left to do. So on success of app 3, we're not going to do anything else. We're not going to run another analytic app. This is our ending point. So I've left that box unchecked. However, since this is our ending point, we're finally going to be displaying results to our user by checking the box to show results to our user here. So let's put this into practice and see how it runs. I'm going to go ahead and from my window here, you can see I've got my little desktop going. Let me just make sure I'm on the right file. So live training, and we are here in Chained Apps today. Let's go ahead and run this app like you might send it to somebody. So app 1, for example, and on that note of sending it to somebody, we will talk about that in just a moment. So I'm just going to go ahead and run this app, and we'll test this out and make sure that this works, that this updates, it's dynamic, just like we hope it would be. Oh, there it is, jumped up over here. So now we can see all of our elements. Well, we don't see all of our elements right now because remember what we've done is we've taken each of those different app elements and we've broken them out onto their separate windows. So don't panic if you're like, oh my gosh, where are all my app interface elements? Remember, they're going to be showing up to you on a different window every time. So you're only going to see one app interface element at a time. So let's just test this out here. Let's show Winter Olympics, just because we haven't looked at Winter Olympics yet. So in my head, I'm already thinking, this is going to be my test, is that I know in my head that the Winter Olympics in 2002 were in Salt Lake City, and I can anticipate already in my head what types of sports I should see in the Winter Olympics, things like ice skating or skiing or biathlon or things like that. So let's just make sure that we see that in our app interface. So we've selected winter. I'm going to click continue. Remember what's going on here is that right now this app is running and those output files are being created in the background to feed the data that I see here in this drop-down menu. And oh my goodness, look at this data that's available to me. One visual check already, 2002. 2002 was a year in which the Winter Olympics were held. So we know that this already has dynamically updated to accommodate that selection that I just made in looking at Winter Olympics. And additionally, the Winter Olympics didn't actually start until 1924. Read Wikipedia this morning, double check that, it's true. 1924 was the start, and sure enough, I don't see any data values before that, so 1900 or 1904, 1908, 1912, 1920 even, that showed up with my Summer Olympics. So I do know that this list is actually relevant to my previous selection. So I'm going to go ahead and pick 2002 here. So now in my head I'm thinking, okay, in my next screen, what should I see? Sports that are relevant to Winter Olympics. So I'm going to continue, generate those output files here. That's feed app 3. And sure enough, what do I see here? I see things like ice hockey. I see things like skeleton, biathlon, bobsleigh, all these things that I know are winter sports. So yes, fantastic. I already know that this has been updated here. So let's go ahead and click a couple sports. We'll select biathlon and ice hockey, and we'll output our results. And so once we run this is where, once we've made all of our final selections, we can see that our outputs have been created. And these are all of our gold medalists in 2002 in those selected sports in biathlon and ice hockey. So it works. That is awesome. One thing I want to give you I want to point out, let me go ahead and open this up again, is that where this also differs, where a chained app will differ from a standard app, are some of these windows that you'll see here. You'll be like, how maybe does a user know to, like, what's coming next? Well, they don't really have any navigation other than by clicking continue. So if they click continue here, they'll know that there's probably another interface element coming up, which there is. Remember, there's select a year, so let's select 1904 for the Summer Olympics. Continue. When it's the final screen or the final application or interface element they have to interact with, you'll notice, let's see, let's just double check this. Tug of war, here we are in 1904 Olympics. They'll have the opportunity to click finish. And finish is when they'll know that this is the final interface element, it's the final opportunity they have to interact with this particular app. This is when they can expect either an output message or some kind of result. Fantastic. So one thing I do want to bring up, just because I mentioned it previously, is sharing a chained app with somebody. Because there are multiple parts to apps, you're probably going to want to make sure that somebody gets these apps all together. So you're going to want to make sure that app 1 and app 2 and app 3 all get sent to a user, whether that's as a package or a zip file, whatever it may be. And you'll see that there was also the opportunity to create relative outputs in a directory for all of these outputs that are being created during an app's processing or an app's running. You might want to leverage those types of settings as well to make sure, because while outputs are created on the fly as an app runs, apps themselves aren't created on the fly. So you do want to make sure that if you're sharing chained apps, that all the components of that application are also sent to your end user or shared on the gallery, or however you're choosing to kind of disseminate or share your process that you've just created. So with that, that brings us here to the end of our designer training. So to just wrap up, and look at that, perfect timing today. Sometimes I tend to run over. We'll go ahead and just wrap up here with a few resources that you have for support. So if you're excited now, you want to go ahead and build your chained app and you're just stoked, a first stop shop for getting started with that might be the Alteryx community. If you run into some questions or you maybe want to get some ideas about how to go about building these chained apps, this is a great place to start. Again, like we talked about before, there's knowledge-based articles, especially there are some great knowledge-based articles on building chained apps and some of those specific configurations that you might want to check out. And some of them we did talk about today. So that might be a really good resource for you to get better and improve your skills with chained applications. Our academy, of course, is where you can register for future live training sessions where you'll be able to complete interactive lessons, participate in weekly challenge, and learn about product certification. All that is available for you and free just with a community account. So I encourage you to check that out. And then if you have questions that are more on the technical level, technical scale, and you're really just in a bind, can't find the answer on community, can't figure it out, just go ahead and send us support or send an email over to our support team at support@alteryx.com. They're some of the smartest, friendliest people I've ever met, and they'd be happy to give you a hand as you go on your Alteryx journey and need a little bit of support or guidance there. So with that, that brings us to the end of the session. We're about 7 minutes before time, which looks like we'll have plenty of time for questions. So I'll go ahead and stay on the line here. I'll go ahead and check out the chat or the Q&A window and see if there's any questions that I can answer there. Otherwise, if you are ready to get back to your Tuesday, thanks again for joining us, and hopefully we'll see you again. And I hope you have a nice day and a nice week until next time. But for those of you who want to stay on the line, I'll go ahead and take some questions for the next few minutes or so.